Keanu Reeves walked through the bright hallways of Jefferson Elementary, just another guest at a charity event meant to support underprivileged students. Teachers smiled politely, kids whispered excitedly, and everything seemed perfectly ordinary, but then he heard it. A teacher's voice, sharp and loud, cutting through the cheerful noise of the school. Keanu stopped in his tracks, his attention drawn to a classroom door left slightly ajar. "You think you can come to school looking like that?" the teacher snapped. "This isn't a place for charity cases." Keanu's heart tightened. Inside, a young boy stood frozen, his head down, trying to hide the tears welling in his eyes. His clothes were old, his shoes falling apart, but it wasn't the boy's appearance that struck Keanu, it was the shame being forced upon him. Most people might have walked away thinking it wasn't their business, but not Keanu Reeves. What he did next would silence the entire school and change one boy's life forever. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The sun cast long golden rays across the playground of Jefferson Elementary, where children's laughter echoed through the hallways, blending with the rustle of backpacks and the squeak of sneakers against polished floors. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday, but today, something special was happening. The school had organized a charity event to raise funds for underprivileged students, and none other than Keanu Reeves was the guest of honor. Keanu arrived quietly, as he always did, dressed simply in a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. He didn't crave attention, but his presence naturally drew curious glances from both students and teachers. Some whispered excitedly, recognizing the humble movie star, while others admired his calm demeanor as he navigated the bustling school corridors. Keanu wasn't here for the spotlight. He was here because he believed in giving back and supporting kids who, like him in his youth, might be struggling with things far beyond their years. As he walked down a hallway toward the auditorium where the event was set to begin, Keanu passed by a classroom with its door slightly ajar. From inside, he heard a sharp, raised voice, a tone that cut through the cheerful atmosphere like a cold wind. It made him pause. "Wait, you can't even bother to wear something decent to school?" the voice snapped. Keanu's brow furrowed. He instinctively stepped closer, his heart tightening as he peered through the small glass window on the door. Inside the classroom stood a boy no older than 10, his head bowed low, his small hands clutching the straps of a threadbare backpack. His shirt was too big, its collar frayed, and his sneakers had holes in them, the soles barely holding together with strips of tape. The boy's cheeks burned with shame as the teacher, a stern man with a crisp shirt and an impatient frown, towered over him. "This is a respectable school," the teacher continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You come in here looking like that and you expect people to take you seriously?" The other students sat frozen in their seats, some staring at their desks, others sneaking sympathetic glances at the boy, whose name, Keanu would later learn, was Tommy. But none of them dared to speak up. The room was heavy with a silence that screamed louder than any words. Keanu felt a familiar ache in his chest. Memories of his own childhood surfaced, memories of wearing hand-me-down clothes, of feeling out of place among wealthier kids, of teachers who looked right through him as if he didn't belong. But what hurt the most was remembering the times when no one had stood up for him. But Keanu wasn't a child anymore, and he wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. Without hesitation, he gently pushed open the door. The room's attention shifted instantly as the students gasped, recognizing the unexpected visitor. Even the teacher's face paled, his authoritative stance faltering as Keanu stepped inside with calm, deliberate strides. For a brief moment, the room was suspended in silence. Then, in his steady, kind voice, Keanu asked, "Is there a problem here?" The teacher stiffened at the sight of Keanu standing in the doorway. His mouth opened as if to say something dismissive, but the words stuck in his throat. The students, wide-eyed and silent, could hardly believe what was unfolding before them. Even Tommy, who had been staring at the floor, dared to glance up, his tear-filled eyes meeting Keanu's calm, steady. Keanu stepped further into the room, his presence quiet but commanding. He didn't have to raise his voice to fill the space. There was something about his demeanor, a mixture of gentleness and strength, that made everyone stop and listen. "I asked," Keanu repeated softly, "is there a problem here?" The teacher, Mr. Reynolds, cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "No, Mr. Reeves," he said with forced politeness, though the irritation still lingered in his tone. "Just addressing some disciplinary issues. This boy," he gestured sharply at Tommy, "continues to show up in inappropriate attire. We have standards at this school." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He looked at Mr. Reynolds for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his eyes back to Tommy. The boy's face was flushed with embarrassment, and he quickly averted his gaze again, as if wishing he could disappear. "What's your name, kid?" Keanu asked gently. The boy hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy." Keanu gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Hey, Tommy, do you mind if I sit here for a minute?" He motioned to an empty desk nearby. Tommy's eyes widened in disbelief, but he nodded hesitantly. Keanu pulled out the chair, sat down, and for a moment, the classroom felt less like a battleground and more like a safe haven. Keanu leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice warm and steady, "when I was your age, I didn't have much either. My mom and I moved around a lot. Sometimes I wore the same clothes for days. They were old, torn, and definitely not what the other kids were wearing. But my mom worked hard, and we did the best we could." The classroom was silent, every student hanging on his words. Even Mr. Reynolds seemed unsure of what to say. Keanu continued, his voice tinged with a quiet emotion. "There were people who looked down on me because of that. Teachers, kids, even strangers. They thought that because I didn't look like them, I wasn't worth much. But you know what? They were wrong." He turned his eyes back to Tommy, who was now watching him intently. "Because what you wear doesn't define who you are. What matters is your heart, your kindness, and how you treat others." Tommy blinked, his lips trembling slightly as he processed Keanu's words. For the first time that day, he felt seen, not as the poor kid in ragged clothes, but as someone who mattered. Keanu shifted his gaze to the rest of the class. "I want you all to remember that. It's easy to judge people based on what you see on the outside, but real strength, real courage, is in looking past that and seeing the person underneath." He let the words sink in before standing up, his eyes meeting Mr. Reynolds's once more. The teacher looked uncomfortable now, his earlier confidence slipping away under Keanu's quiet scrutiny. "I hope," Keanu said, softly but firmly, "that we can all learn something today." With that, he placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder before walking to the front of the class. "Tommy," he said with a warm smile, "why don't you come join me at the assembly? I think we could use someone like you." Tommy's eyes widened in disbelief. Keanu nodded. "Yeah." The boy stood slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel ashamed. He felt proud. As they walked out of the classroom together, Keanu glanced back at the stunned faces of the students and at Mr. Reynolds, who now stood speechless, his authority crumbling in the wake of a simple, powerful truth. The door closed behind them, but the lesson Keanu had left behind lingered in the room like a quiet echo, challenging everyone to reconsider how they saw the world and each other. The corridor outside the classroom felt quieter than before, as if the building itself had sensed the weight of what had just transpired. Tommy walked beside Keanu, his small steps quickening to match the actor's long strides. But even in his nervousness, he felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted, if only for a moment. They approached the auditorium, where students, teachers, and parents were gathering for the charity event. The hum of excited chatter filled the air, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional squeak of folding chairs being arranged. Bright banners adorned the walls, proudly announcing the school's efforts to support underprivileged families. It was ironic, Keanu thought, considering what had just happened in that classroom. As they neared the entrance, Principal Harris, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, spotted Keanu and hurried over, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her face lit up with the kind of smile reserved for celebrities and benefactors. "Mr. Reeves," she exclaimed, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "We're so honored to have you here today. The children have been buzzing with excitement." Keanu shook her hand politely, but glanced down at Tommy, who shifted uncomfortably under the principal's gaze. Harris seemed to notice him for the first time, her smile faltering slightly as her eyes flicked over his worn clothes. "And who's this?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "This is Tommy," Keanu replied, his voice steady. "He's joining me for the event." Principal Harris blinked, clearly surprised but too diplomatic to question it outright. "Oh, well, that's wonderful," she said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're about to begin. Please, come in." They entered the auditorium, where rows of students sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces turned expectantly toward the stage. Parents and teachers lined the back of the room, murmuring amongst themselves. As Keanu and Tommy made their way to the front, the crowd began to quiet, recognizing the actor's familiar face. Whispers rippled through the audience. "Is that Keanu Reeves? Who's that kid with him?" Tommy felt the weight of their stares, his shoulders hunching as if to shield himself from their judgment. But Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his back, guiding him toward the podium. The simple gesture sent a clear message. "You belong here." Principal Harris stepped up to the microphone, her voice amplified through the speakers. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, we have a very special guest with us today. Please join me in welcoming the one and only Keanu Reeves." The room erupted in applause, the students cheering and clapping with unfiltered excitement. Keanu smiled modestly, waiting for the noise to subside before stepping up to the podium. But instead of launching into a prepared speech, he did something unexpected. He motioned for Tommy to join him on stage. The boy's eyes widened in panic, and he shook his head quickly, but Keanu leaned down and whispered, "You're braver than you think, Tommy. Trust me." Reluctantly, Tommy climbed the few steps to the stage, standing awkwardly beside Keanu as the room fell into a curious hush. Keanu placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and then he began to speak. "I know you were all expecting me to talk about movies or fame," Keanu said, his voice calm and sincere. "But today, I want to talk about something more important." He paused, letting the silence settle. "I met someone very special today. His name is Tommy." Keanu glanced down at the boy, whose face was flushed, but whose eyes were now fixed on the crowd. "Tommy reminded me of something I've never forgotten. That what we wear, what we have, doesn't define who we are." A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. Some students exchanged glances, while a few teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Keanu continued, his tone unwavering. "When I was Tommy's age, I didn't have much. My clothes were old, my shoes were falling apart. There were people who thought that meant I wasn't worth their time, but they were wrong, because kindness, courage, and integrity, those things have nothing to do with money." The room was silent now, the weight of his words settling over the audience like a heavy blanket. Keanu's eyes scanned the crowd, pausing briefly when they landed on Mr. Reynolds, who stood near the back of the room, his face pale and tight-lipped. "There are people in this world who will judge you by how you look, by what you have or don't have. But I'm here to tell you," Keanu said, his voice firm and resonant, "that those people are wrong. What matters is how you treat others, how you carry yourself, and how you rise above the judgments." Tommy stood a little taller beside him, the warmth of Keanu's words wrapping around him like a protective shield. Keanu smiled gently at the boy before turning back to the microphone. "So today, I challenge all of you, students, teachers, parents, to look beyond appearances. See the heart, not the clothes. And remember that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves respect and kindness." The room remained silent for a beat longer, the depth of Keanu's message sinking in. Then, slowly, the applause began, tentative at first, then growing louder, until the entire auditorium was clapping. But this time, it wasn't just for Keanu Reeves, the movie star. It was for the message he had delivered, and for the boy standing beside him, who had unknowingly become the heart of it all. As Keanu and Tommy left the stage, the boy's steps were steadier, his eyes brighter. But in the crowd, Mr. Reynolds watched them go, his face dark with resentment. The humiliation he felt wasn't just from being called out. It was from being exposed, his authority undermined in front of the entire school. And deep down, Keanu knew this wasn't the end of it. Something told him that Mr. Reynolds wasn't the kind of man to let this go quietly. The applause still echoed in the hallways as Keanu and Tommy stepped out of the auditorium. But while the crowd inside buzzed with admiration, Keanu felt a lingering tension, like the air before a storm. He could sense it, the weight of unspoken resentment, the kind that simmered beneath polite smiles and claps. And he knew exactly where it was coming from. As they made their way down the corridor, Keanu leaned down to Tommy, his voice gentle. "How are you feeling, buddy?" Tommy's eyes were wide, but there was a spark in them that hadn't been there before. "Better," he whispered, his voice still shaky but filled with something new. "Hope." Keanu smiled and ruffled his hair. "You did great up there." But just as they turned the corner toward the front entrance, a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. Mr. Reeves." Keanu stopped, his shoulders tightening. He turned to see Mr. Reynolds standing at the end of the hallway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mask of forced professionalism, but his eyes betrayed the anger simmering beneath. "I need a word," Reynolds said, his tone clipped and cold. Keanu's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Of course." He turned to Tommy. "Hey, why don't you wait for me by the front steps, all right? I'll be right there." Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting between the two men, but Keanu's reassuring nod gave him the courage to step away, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in his chest. Once the boy was out of earshot, Mr. Reynolds stepped closer, his face tightening into a sneer. "I don't know what you think you accomplished in there," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, "but you've overstepped." Keanu met his gaze without flinching. "I stood up for a kid who didn't deserve to be humiliated." Reynolds' nostrils flared. "That boy needs discipline, not coddling. You celebrities come in here thinking you can preach your feel-good nonsense, but you don't understand what it's like to manage a classroom, to deal with these kids day in and day out." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet, steely edge. "No, I don't run a classroom, but I know what it's like to be that kid, and I know the damage someone like you can do." For a moment, Reynolds seemed taken aback, but his pride quickly reasserted itself. He straightened, his lips curling into a smirk. "Well, Mr. Reeves, you've made quite the spectacle today, but you'll be gone tomorrow. I'll still be here. And kids like Tommy?" He chuckled darkly. "They don't last long in places like this." Keanu's stomach twisted at the implication. He had seen this before. People in power using their authority to crush those who were vulnerable, hiding behind rules and systems to justify their cruelty. But Keanu wasn't about to walk away. "I'll be watching," he said quietly, his gaze steady and unwavering. "And trust me, you won't get away with this." Reynolds' smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a dismissive wave. "We'll see about that." Keanu turned on his heel and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Tommy waiting on the steps outside, his small figure hunched against the chill in the air. When the boy saw Keanu, he straightened, a tentative smile breaking across his face. But Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that evening, after Keanu had dropped Tommy off at home, meeting his mother, a tired woman with kind eyes who was doing her best to hold everything together, he sat in his car, staring at the dashboard. His mind replayed the events of the day, but his thoughts kept circling back to Reynolds' words. "They don't last long in places like this." Keanu knew he couldn't just walk away. His fame gave him a platform, and he was going to use it. The next morning, Keanu returned to the school not as a guest, but as an advocate. He met with Principal Harris, laying out everything he had witnessed, from Reynolds' verbal abuse to the toxic atmosphere it created. At first, Harris was defensive, trying to downplay the incident as a misunderstanding. But Keanu didn't back down. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But if this is how your staff treats students, especially those who are struggling, then it's not just one teacher who's the problem, it's the whole system that allows it." Harris's face paled. She knew the weight Keanu's words carried, not just in the community, but in the public eye. And she also knew the damage a story like this could do if it reached the media. Within days, an investigation was launched. Parents and students came forward, sharing their own stories of Reynolds' behavior, stories that had been buried out of fear or resignation. The school board had no choice but to take action. But Keanu didn't stop there. He reached out to local organizations, using his influence to raise funds for students like Tommy. He helped establish a program that provided not just financial assistance, but mentorship and support for kids facing hardship. He even visited the school regularly, not as a celebrity, but as a friend and advocate for the students. As for Mr. Reynolds, he was quietly removed from his position, his authority dismantled by the very community he had tried to suppress. Weeks later, at a school assembly, Keanu stood at the podium once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. Tommy stood beside him, his posture confident, his eyes bright with a newfound sense of belonging. "This," Keanu said, resting a hand on Tommy's shoulder, "is what happens when we stand up for each other. When we see beyond the surface and recognize the worth in every person, no matter what they wear or where they come from." The auditorium erupted in applause, not just for Keanu, but for the message he had carried and the change he had inspired. And as Tommy looked out over the crowd, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was seen. He was valued. And thanks to Keanu Reeves, he, and every other kid like him, knew they mattered. The weeks that followed were transformative, not just for Tommy, but for the entire Jefferson Elementary School. The buzz surrounding Keanu Reeves' unexpected intervention hadn't died down. In fact, it had grown louder. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, and soon it wasn't just the school that was paying attention. The whole community was watching. Parents started asking questions, students felt emboldened to speak up, and the administration could no longer hide behind formalities and dismissals. But while the school seemed to be moving toward a better future, not everyone was ready to let go of the past. Mr. Reynolds had been suspended pending the investigation, but his absence hung over the school like a dark cloud. Some teachers, those who had been friends or silent allies of Reynolds, whispered in the staff room, their resentment simmering just beneath the surface. They viewed Keanu's involvement as an intrusion, a disruption of their carefully controlled environment. And while they wouldn't dare speak against him openly, their discontent found other, subtler ways to seep into the school's culture. For Tommy, the days after the assembly were filled with both hope and unease. On one hand, he felt lighter than he had in months. Keanu's kindness and support had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. He walked through the halls with his head held higher, no longer avoiding the gazes of his classmates. Many of them treated him differently now, offering smiles and even inviting him to join their games during recess. For the first time, Tommy felt like he belonged. But there was a shadow that lingered. He couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Reynolds' cold, piercing eyes, the threat veiled behind his words. Even though the teacher was gone, Tommy felt as if he could still hear his voice echoing in the back of his mind, reminding him of all the times he'd been told he wasn't good enough. Then, one day, the shadow became real again. It was a chilly Thursday morning when Tommy arrived at school, his breath visible in the crisp air as he trudged up the steps with his backpack slung over one shoulder. As he entered the building, he felt an unusual tension in the air, like the school itself was holding its breath. Students whispered in hushed tones, glancing nervously down the hallways. Tommy's heart began to race as he turned the corner toward his classroom and stopped, dead in his tracks. There, standing by the door to room 204, was Mr. Reynolds. He wasn't wearing his usual stern expression or his crisp buttoned-up shirt. Instead, he looked disheveled, his hair slightly out of place, his face pale and drawn. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same. They locked onto Tommy the moment he appeared, and for a split second, the boy felt like he was right back in that classroom, being humiliated in front of his peers. He closed the lock on his office door as the boy, "Tommy," Reynolds said quietly, almost too softly to hear. Tommy's feet felt glued to the floor. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He's not supposed to be here. That was the only thought that kept repeating itself in his head. He's not supposed to be here. Before Tommy could react, Before he could even turn to run, a familiar voice called out from behind him. "Tell me." It was Keanu. He had arrived at the school for another scheduled visit, but when he saw Tommy frozen in the hallway, his instincts kicked in. He followed the boy's wide-eyed stare, and his expression hardened the moment he saw Reynolds. The tension between the two men was immediate and palpable. Keanu strode forward, placing a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder, his calm demeanor now laced with an unmistakable edge. "What are you doing here?" Keanu's voice was low, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of danger in it. Reynolds straightened slightly, trying to regain the authority he once wielded so effortlessly, but it was clear his confidence was shaken. "I'm here to collect some personal items," he muttered, his gaze flickering between Keanu and Tommy. "Nothing more." Keanu didn't move. His hand remained steady on Tommy's shoulder, grounding the boy who still felt like the floor might disappear beneath him at any moment. "You got no business talking to this kid," Keanu said quietly, but there was no mistaking the warning in his tone. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but whatever retort he had died on his lips. He knew he had lost, not just his job but his power. The man who had once controlled his classroom with fear and intimidation now stood exposed and vulnerable. Without another word, Reynolds turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway until they faded into silence. Keanu knelt down beside Tommy, his eyes softening. "You okay?" Tommy swallowed hard and nodded, though his heart was still racing. "Yeah," he whispered. I think so." Keanu gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're stronger than you think, Tommy. You didn't let him win." For the first time since he had seen Reynolds, Tommy allowed himself to breathe. He realized that Keanu was right. The fear, the humiliation, it didn't define him anymore. The man who had once made him feel small was gone, and in his place stood someone stronger, someone who knew his worth. As they stood up together, Keanu glanced down the hallway one last time, ensuring Reynolds was truly gone. Then he turned back to Tommy with a reassuring smile. "Let's get to class." Tommy nodded, and as they walked toward the classroom, the fear that had once gripped him began to dissolve, replaced by something new. The confrontation with Mr. Reynolds might have ended in the hallway, but the ripple effects were far from over. Keanu knew that fear and intimidation left deep scars, especially on kids like Tommy. But he also knew something else. He had the power to help turn those scars into strength. Later that day, the school gathered once again in the auditorium. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that something important was about to happen. Word of Mr. Reynolds' unexpected appearance had spread quickly, and whispers filled the air like static electricity. But Keanu wasn't going to let fear be the last word. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell into a hush. This wasn't just another celebrity appearance. Everyone could feel it. This was personal. Keanu didn't stand at the podium this time. Instead, he moved to the center of the stage, where he could meet the students' eyes directly. And beside him, once again, stood Tommy. "I know today's been intense," Keanu began, his voice steady but warm. "And I know some of you might be feeling confused or even scared after what happened this morning." The students listened, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and concern. Keanu paused, giving the weight of his words time to settle. "But here's the thing about fear," he continued. "It only has power if we let it. People like Mr. Reynolds, they thrive on making others feel small because deep down they're afraid themselves. Afraid of losing control, afraid of seeing others rise above them." He glanced down at Tommy, who stood a little taller now, his chin lifted with quiet pride. "But the truth is," Keanu said, turning back to the crowd, "we're stronger than fear. Stronger than the people who try to hold us down. And the proof of that is right here." He gently placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Tommy stood up to something no kid should ever have to face, and he didn't let it break him. That's what real courage looks like. The room remained silent for a beat, the weight of Keanu's words sinking into every heart. Then, slowly, the students began to clap. It wasn't the wild, celebrity-fueled applause from the first assembly. This was something deeper, more genuine. a recognition of Tommy's bravery and of the resilience within each of them. Keanu waited for the applause to die down before speaking again. "I want all of you to remember something," he said, his voice soft but firm. "No matter what anyone tells you about your clothes, your family, your worth, you matter. You deserve respect, and you have the power to stand up for yourself and for each other." He looked out over the sea of faces, feeling a surge of hope. Maybe today wasn't just about Tommy. Maybe it was about every kid in that room who had ever felt invisible, every student who had ever been told they weren't enough. "And if you ever feel like you can't do it alone," Keanu added, his eyes locking with Tommy's one last time, "remember, you don't have to. There's always someone who will stand with you." As Keanu and Tommy left the stage, the applause followed them like a wave, washing away the last remnants of fear and replacing it with something far stronger: unity. In the weeks that followed, the school transformed. Students began to look out for one another in ways they never had before. Teachers became more attentive, more compassionate. The atmosphere shifted from one of quiet tension to one of open support. But the most significant change was in Tommy. The boy who had once shrunk beneath the weight of shame now walked the halls with his head high, his heart open. He knew now that he mattered, not just because Keanu Reeves had stood up for him, but because he had learned to stand up for himself. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all. Months passed, and Jefferson Elementary was no longer the same school it had been when Keanu first stepped through its doors. The walls that once echoed with whispered judgments and silent fears now resonated with laughter, support, and a newfound sense of community. The story of what happened with Tommy had spread far beyond the school's walls. It became a symbol, a reminder that kindness and courage could triumph over cruelty and indifference. For Tommy, life had shifted in ways he could never have imagined. His mother, inspired by Keanu's intervention, found herself surrounded by support from the community. Donations poured in anonymously to help with clothing, school supplies, and even groceries. But more important than the material support was the emotional one. Neighbors offering help, teachers reaching out with genuine care, and classmates who now saw Tommy not as the poor kid, but as a friend and a symbol of resilience. Keanu continued to stay in touch. He didn't just make a grand gesture and disappear. He became a mentor, checking in with Tommy and his family regularly. Sometimes it was a simple phone call to see how school was going. Other times it was a surprise visit to watch Tommy play in a local soccer game. His presence was no longer just that of a celebrity, it was that of a friend, someone who had come into their lives at the exact moment they needed him most. But Keanu's influence didn't stop with Tommy. Inspired by the events at Jefferson Elementary, he partnered with local organizations to create a scholarship program aimed at helping underprivileged children in the community. The program didn't just offer financial support. It provided mentorship, after-school programs, and emotional guidance for students who needed it most. The initiative was named the Tommy Project, in honor of the boy whose courage had sparked a movement. Meanwhile, Mr. Reynolds' story took a different turn. After his suspension, the investigation revealed a long history of complaints from both students and parents, complaints that had been buried or ignored. The exposure left him without a position, and his reputation within the education system was irreparably damaged. But more than his professional downfall, Reynolds was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. For the first time, he had to see himself through the eyes of those he had hurt. As for the school, Principal Harris took Keanu's message to heart. She began implementing new policies to foster inclusivity and kindness, ensuring that no child would feel the way Tommy had. Workshops on empathy and respect became part of the curriculum, and teachers were given additional training to recognize and address bullying and discrimination. The school that had once turned a blind eye to silent struggles now stood as a beacon of hope in the community. On the last day of the school year, a special assembly was held. Students, parents, and teachers gathered in the same auditorium where Keanu had first delivered his heartfelt speech. But this time, the spotlight wasn't on Keanu, it was on Tommy. As he stepped onto the stage, Tommy felt a familiar flutter of nerves in his chest, but when he looked out over the sea of faces, his friends, his teachers, his family, he felt something stronger than fear: pride. Keanu stood off to the side, watching with a proud smile as Tommy approached the microphone. The boy took a deep breath, his voice steady and clear as he began to speak. Sometimes people will tell you that you don't belong. They'll say you're not good enough because of how you look or what you have. But that's not true. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. What matters is how you treat others and how you believe in yourself, even when it's hard. The room was silent, every word sinking into the hearts of those listening. I used to think I was invisible, Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. But now I know I'm not, and neither are any of you. As the applause swelled around him, Tommy glanced at Keanu, who gave him a small nod of approval. It wasn't just about overcoming one bad teacher or one bad day. It was about finding his voice and using it to inspire others. The assembly ended with a standing ovation, not just for Tommy, but for the journey that everyone in that room had taken. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, kindness and courage could light the way forward. And as Keanu left the school that day, he felt a deep sense of peace. He hadn't just stepped in to protect a boy from a cruel teacher. He had helped ignite a spark that would continue to burn brightly in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the power of standing up for what's right. Tommy's story was no longer just his own. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the undeniable truth that one act of kindness could change everything. Years later, Tommy stood once again in front of an audience, but this time it wasn't in his elementary school auditorium. Dressed in a crisp suit with confidence radiating from him, he was giving a speech at a community event for the Tommy Project, now a nationally recognized program helping underprivileged kids across the country. As he spoke about his journey, from a scared boy in tattered clothes to a mentor and advocate for others facing similar struggles, his eyes found a familiar face in the crowd. Keanu, a little older now, sat quietly, his trademark humble smile in place, proud but never seeking the spotlight. After the event, Tommy approached Keanu, and they shared a quiet moment away from the crowd. "You changed my life," Tommy said softly. Keanu shook his head, his voice equally gentle. "No, Tommy, you changed your life. I just reminded you of the strength you already had." Tommy smiled, knowing Keanu was right, but he also knew that one person's kindness had been the spark that set everything in motion. And as they stood there, two lives forever intertwined by a moment of courage, it was clear that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could create the most profound waves of change.